And now we're going to go into a presentation from Joan Ganny. I met her in Los Angeles in the 90s. I was in a bookstore, Blue Moon Books, looking for paperbacks of Bukowski and Miller. And this lady was there. What are you looking at? Bukowski? I knew Bukowski. I photographed him. Looking for Miller too. I photographed Miller. So we developed a correspondence. I've kept in touch with her over the years. And she has a series that she did of well-known refrigerators. This is Henry Miller's refrigerator. So Joan, come on up, and she has a nice presentation about photographing Henry Miller asleep and falling asleep.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Can you hear me all right back there? Great, because I have a phobia about microphones, even after having a radio career. It's an honor to be here, and Bill and Roger deserve such kudos for this labor of love that's taken a good couple of years, if not longer. I also want to dedicate my portion to Emil White because it's his centenary, right? And you saw that photograph of Emil and this lady with the buttocks, and that's just how I like to remember Emil, cheeky and always with a twinkle in his eye. And today when we were at the library, I was speaking to Dana, who was behind the counter and a colleague of Magnus, and I mentioned that I had stayed at the library in 1986 when I was driving to, through Northern California before I moved to Europe. I was taking a road trip. I rented a convertible and I was going up Highway 1 and I wanted to see the library. And I went there and it said closed, and I was just devastated because I thought, what am I going to do? I've driven all this way, and how can I get in? And I had also tried to get a room at Deachin's Motel up the road, and they were booked. So I thought I'll have to go to Monterey and come back, and what'll I do? And I just kind of stubbornly went back to the library, and I knocked on the door, and a woman answered and asked, what I wanted. I told her, and I said, is there any way at all I could see the library? I was a friend of Henry's, and I'm a journalist, and I'll be in Europe, and don't know when I'll be back this way. And the door was open as we were speaking, and all of a sudden a voice from the back of the room called out, Betty, Betty, who's there? And what's going on? And this man in a little wheelchair, or I forget if it was a walker, came over. She said, "Oh, Emil, it's this lady that wants to visit the library." And he said, "Well, have her come in. Just invite her in. There's no problem." And I went in and we spoke and I introduced myself. And he said, "All right, well, you're here. And, where are you going to stay tonight?" I said, "Well, that's a problem. I've tried to get something up the road." He said, "Well, Betty, can we make her up a place to sleep?" And she said, "Certainly, Emil, we'll do that." And then he looked at me and he said, "Well, now you only have one difficult question to answer." And I thought, okay. And he said, "Do you want red or white wine with your dinner?" And that was my introduction to Emil White. And true to when I told this story to Dana today, part of the story, she said, "Well, he's the biggest lecturer in Big Sur. Did he come on to you?" And I said, "He was very old. He just had a stroke. And being in the spirit of Henry, he said, would I sit down on his lap and, let him kiss me?" And I said, "Emil, nothing ever happened with Henry and I'm not going to set a precedent with you because Henry's looking right down and it would be just total betrayal." And I said, "Besides, I think it's just much too much for your blood pressure." And we had an early dinner, and they had, Betty, who was his caretaker, had the library looked much different in 1986. There's no point trying to describe it, but the kitchen isn't there anymore. The bathroom is the same, but there was a wall, as Bill explained to me today, because I was trying to figure out where did I sleep. There had been rows and rows of bookcases, and in the middle, in between two bookcases, they had made me a sleeping area with some kind of sleeping mattress and pillow, and it was all very civilized, and I was just thrilled to be there, and he said I could stay a few nights. And I went and brushed my teeth. I came back, and on my pillow was a brown envelope, a manila envelope with my name on it. I thought, what's this? And I picked it up and I opened it, and to my amazement, it was the sheaf of letters from Henry and Anais to each other, the love letters that I'd only heard about, but never knew if they were existed. And I stayed up all night reading them. There weren't that many, I think 15 or so. And after I read them, I copied them all by hand in my journal, not to share with anybody, but just for me, because I felt I had to read them again and again, and that it would be all right with Henry. And I wound up writing my second poetry chapbook, finishing it there at the library the next days, took off, moved to Europe, and that was in 1987. So that was why I want to salute Emil tonight, because he was generous and welcoming. The other person I'd like to honor tonight is, in his absence, is one of the great gentleman publishers of the Santa Barbara area, and there were two. John Martin, who worked with Noel Young, and they had Capra Press, and of course John Martin went on to start Black Sparrow Press, that is where Charles Bukowski is based, Diane Wachowski, Wanda Coleman. Last week at Beyond Baroque, I had an exhibition of my Charles Bukowski portraits in the Wanda Coleman Theater. And that was really an honor because I knew Wanda back in the day in LA when we were young poets. And these things just all seem to come full circle. So Noel was a champion of mine as a young poet and journalist, and we met at the 1976 ABA convention in San Francisco, the American Booksellers, when I was trying to sell my book Ice Picks, a book of famous people in the refrigerators. And that featured a lot of young, up-and-coming creative folks like Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, who else? Well, we had a mix of people, Phyllis Diller, Marty Feldman, Paul Morrissey, who was Andy Warhol's filmmaker. Anyway, on and on and on. But unfortunately, the price of silver had shot up in those years, so Agfa photographic paper became highly expensive, and that meant a book like this that at the time would sell for $10 would have been $35, and in 1976 that was a fortune. So anyway, just because of those gentlemen publishers, Noel always wanted me to meet Henry, but the timing was off, and actually by that time I had I knew Noel for a few years before that, but I'd interviewed Henry in 1975. So maybe, we could do this. There's a bunch of beautiful photos of Henry, but do you want to scan some of them, Bill, with your magic thing? Oh yeah, beautiful. Any way you do it is lovely. Thank you. As long as I'm not involved. 1975, Los Angeles, I read in the Times that Henry Miller was going to be doing a guest lecture at a theater of Jack Garfine, a theater producer in Beverly Hills, an evening with Henry Miller. And I just couldn't believe my eyes. I've thrown away my speech. I thought there's a bunch of academics here and wonderful colleagues, and I'm not going to go on and on and on, but I'll come back to it because I kind of like the introduction. There's one I wrote with the left side of my brain and one with the right side at 3 o'clock this morning. So maybe I'll run that by you. But I think the most important thing, after hearing so many inspired stories and papers the last days, it's really enriched my knowledge. But anyway, as a young journalist, I thought I have to be at this event. And I called the theater and they told me they were sold out. It was impossible. And I didn't know a lot of journalistic tricks at the time, but I kept calling, and finally I said I had an assignment, and it was with Penthouse Magazine. And I was writing for Penthouse's women's magazine called Viva, which had just started. But I knew, as a lot of journalists did, that the best way to break in, and the magazines that paid the most money, were Penthouse and Playboy. And Penthouse was easier to get into, and they were in Los Angeles. So they assured me that Henry's secretary would call me, which she finally did, Connie, and said there would be one ticket left waiting for me at the box office. I also called my editor at Viva and told her I had this Henry Miller interview. And so she gave me the go-ahead. And it was for the most I've ever earned as a journalist at the time. around $800, which bought me a beautiful Adler electric typewriter, and Henry appreciated that. But anyway, I went to the theater. My seat was in the balcony in the very last row. I had a notebook with me. I figured if he's going to answer some questions for the audience afterward, I'll take notes, and I took notes of the things he was talking about. He was in great shape, a lot like in Tom Schiller's film. And the evening was marvelous. And after he answered the last questions, he looked around the theater and he called out to Connie. He said, "Hey, Connie, you said the press was showing up here tonight. Where are the press? Where's that crazy woman that you said kept calling every day and bothering you? Where is she? She's the press. Where is she?" And I thought, oh my, I think he's talking about me. And nobody else stood up. So I called down. I said, Mr. Miller, well, I'm not crazy, but I am the woman that's been calling you for several days, and I just want to do an interview, and that's all. And he said, well, then you better come down here and speak to Connie, and we'll make an appointment. And I went, well, my heart was pounding as it is now a little bit, and I went down there and met Connie, and, well, of course, Henry. And I went to dinner about 5 days later, and indeed drove to Pacific Palisades, saw the sign on the door about, do not disturb the old man. And also, when the translated version, a cruder version that I know of, is basically that was on his letterhead, but I have to say it anyway, when shit becomes of value, the rich will take away the assholes of the poor. But I mean, this was Henry's humor and wisdom, in a nutshell. But that first interview turned into several meetings over dinner. And then just after the interview came out, which it came out in Viva rather than Penthouse because it seemed more pertinent for a women's magazine trying to go for the thinking woman and not the Cosmo woman, that it would be better to put Henry in there. And I think that was a good decision. What can I say? I have some photographs. This in the Blue Bathrobe series, I call it, and I'm honored to be paired with Thomas Schiller's Asleep and Awake, because Henry was in his his dark blue robe after the white robe series. And at the time, Tony didn't want me to use these portraits because he had liver marks on his hand. But, at that age, you're not going to cover them up with concealer. Nobody's looking at his hands, I think. I think his beautiful countenance was enough. Here he is in his study reading Playboy. He wasn't really reading Playboy, but it was there and he picked it up to amuse me. But otherwise, nothing is really posed. It was lovely in the film to see so much conversation in that infamous bathroom where I photographed him a lot in and out of the mirrors, and he asked me if I'd sign something on the wall, which I did. And just being there, and he was actually writing. I had been in the other room talking to Twinka. At the time, he was, as he said, blind in one eye, deaf in one ear. He had the sciatica in his hip, and he needed a walker to get around. So he was more frail here than we see in the Schiller film, although you see him with a walking stick. And, I'm going to just backtrack a little bit because I think I'm not going to give you any academic stuff that I had. But I just wanted to start out, and then I'll find my text from this morning. Yeah, okay. It's just a little riff. I got a lot of jazz in my life, so it's okay to improvise. But I just wanted to start out and say, you know this anyway. But iconoclastic and enigmatic, acclaimed, reviled, honored, censored, spontaneous, committed, deliberate, curious, adamant, obstreperous, and original. Henry Valentine Miller led a life that many aspire to live. I was 15 when I found 2 worn copies of The Tropics sequestered in my mother's closet, my mother Adele. And she was a wonderful glamour photographer on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood that was also a CPA from Indiana University and quite glamorous herself. Her brother Royal, who had served in the army in Paris, and came back after the war and had brought these with him in the traditional brown wrapper, the infamous brown wrapper. So I started with Tropic of Cancer, reading it in spurts and starts, aware I'd opened a Pandora's box, a passport to possibility, an unknown territory that I was eager to explore, but it was up to me to provide the stamps. And yeah, Henry Miller was a force of nature, and I felt at 15, I didn't know what half of the words were. I remember asking my mother very cautiously, "What does cunt mean?" And she said, "Well, it's kind of like an oyster." And I thought, which didn't really answer my question, but it's okay. You kind of skip through and you improvise and you figure it out. Right. So, I've told you about being blind in one eye. Yeah, he was the life force, and yeah. In his body of work, it's in his innocent yet deliberate paintings, his love of life. We're all here to pay homage to this rugged individual from Brooklyn who would not wish to be deified, glorified, or elevated and overanalyzed. So if we take anything from this excellent, well-organized seminar, it should be to embrace the unknown Miller, to celebrate the small details, transcend the bullshit, and bring Henry into the 21st century. I thought this morning, what would Henry think about all of this if he were to grace us with his presence today? And it was so wonderful walking in and seeing this screen. And I had tears a bit just hearing that growl. But I thought, what would Henry think? I mean, I think he'd appreciate the attention, but would also repudiate the adulation. He was curious, hungry for knowledge, with the awareness that there were higher powers at play, whether in the stars in sidereal time, or in the necessity of quiet contemplation, where speculation shadow danced with the spiritual. Think of these things, said Krishnamurti, but above all, follow your spirit, discover your destiny, and always be merry and bright. So basically, I think I'll end there. I'm probably leaving out a lot of stuff, but I think questions are welcome and the pictures can speak for themselves. Yeah. Right. Yeah, actually, it's running for 2 months instead of one, which is unprecedented. So through December 20th, it's called East of Western. I also have, some of you know about this already, 2 of my portraits of Henry, which I created for this event to sell to you at only, a very nothing price. So a souvenir, if you're interested, and otherwise there are fine prints that can be ordered of these portraits. But, and the last, let me just go back to something that's the last words, if I can find it. Yeah. I mean, you saw so much about his house and the bathroom and all of that. And I think, yeah, I just think I want to say his body may have been aged and frail in the end, but his spirit remained young, nurtured by a wisdom of the heart, to borrow his own term. So thank you. Yeah.